A study claiming to measure the effect of quantum entanglement on consciousness was published in January 2025 in the peer-reviewed journal Computational and Structural Biotechnology journal. Without any delay, here's the most striking sentence from the introduction. What if quantum entanglement could elevate conscious experience to a higher level and even accelerate the learning process? That's a bold question. In fact, the entire premise is even bolder. Until now, just like in the double-slit experiments, we've mostly seen studies exploring how the observer affects quantum systems. But the paper behind today's video flips that completely, investigating how entangled qubits might affect human consciousness. And that's genuinely fascinating. This study presents empirical and statistical data on how quantum entanglement may influence consciousness at the biophysical level. To be honest, as someone who usually considers ideas like quantum consciousness or quantum leaps to be outside the bounds of serious science, I was genuinely surprised by the claim, especially because it's supported by concrete data. Frankly, had this paper not been published in a peer-reviewed journal, I probably wouldn't even be talking about it. The article argues that classical science alone may not be enough to explain how we experience consciousness. For example, what it feels like to sense the warmth of a hug. And that's not my personal interpretation. The author, Alex Escolagaskin, presents it exactly that way. In short, he's asking, why can't classical science fully explain what we feel? The researchers designed a learning experiment by dividing 106 identical twins into two groups. Their goal was to test which group would perform better in terms of learning under specific conditions. Because the participants were identical twins, it was assumed that their brain structures would be highly similar, though, of course, this isn't guaranteed in every case. Each twin pair was integrated into a system connected to IBM's Brisbane quantum supercomputer. In other words, the screen each subject looked at was directly linked to this machine. First, the control group was defined. Their screens were connected to a system that operated without quantum entanglement. Meanwhile, the experimental group sat in front of screens connected to a quantum entangled circuit of the same computer. To be honest, this is a highly ambitious and creative experimental design. Even though I know that quantum entanglement is independent of distance, I couldn't help but wonder about the physical separation between the participants and the computer. Considering that the IBM Brisbane quantum computer is located in Australia, while the subjects were in Madrid, where the study was conducted, the distance is striking. In the paper, this setup is described as operating under non-local conditions. So, even if the system wasn't cloud-based, we can assume a distance of at least 10,000 kilometers between the computer and the participants. Once seated in front of their screens, the twin participants were subjected to a learning test consisting of 144 trials each. That adds up to 30,528 individual data points in total. During the test, extremely brief and subtle visual stimuli, such as small symbols or light patterns, were presented on the screen, too fast to be consciously noticed. Each stimulus appeared for only 400 microseconds, that's roughly 700 times shorter than the blink of an eye. Honestly, I doubt I'd be able to notice anything in that span. According to the literature, conscious perception typically requires at least 200,000 microseconds, meaning the stimuli used here were about 1/500th of that threshold, far too brief for anyone to say, "I saw that." According to the article, the author appears to have based the choice of such a short exposure time on findings from previous research. In the experiment, participants were required to press a specific key in response to a stimulus shown far below the threshold of conscious perception. So, what exactly were they shown? Some participants were exposed to emotionally charged images they couldn't consciously recognize, while others were shown dots moving either left or right, randomly or following a hidden pattern. After each presentation, participants were asked to press the left or right key on the keyboard, depending on which direction they felt the dots were moving. Given how short the exposure time was, it's more accurate to say their responses were based on intuition or guesswork, rather than conscious decision-making. Another possibility is that they simply responded at random. Meanwhile, the experiment used highly specialized equipment to ensure the visual stimuli reached participants with the required precision. Participants were placed on chin rests to keep their heads steady, and their eye level was carefully aligned for accurate presentation. The stimuli were delivered through 20-inch custom-designed stereoscopic lenses. Judging by the technical setup, it's clear that this experiment required a serious budget. During each trial, participants made their directional guesses by pressing either the left or right key, and their responses were recorded in real time. Throughout the test, their brain activity was monitored at high resolution using 3D EEG devices. At the end of the experiment, biological samples, including blood and saliva, were collected to assess brain, body biomarkers. All of this data was analyzed to determine whether the responses were merely reflexive or stemmed from unconscious learning. By examining both the accuracy of behavioral responses and the brain's internal reactions, the researchers aimed to explore the potential cognitive effects of quantum entanglement. So, let's start with the result we're all most curious about. Participants exposed to quantum entangled visuals pressed the correct key 84.5% of the time. That translates to 12,591 correct and 2,312 incorrect responses. The other group, those who viewed visuals without quantum entanglement, had a success rate of 80.83%, with 12,337 correct and 2,926 incorrect answers. In total, that's a difference of 614 more errors in the non-entangled group. The author of the paper interprets these results as follows. Stimuli structured through quantum entanglement may contain a quantum architecture capable of influencing unconscious cognitive decisions during learning. The authors view the statistically significant increase in accuracy observed in the experimental group, as compared to the control group, as strong evidence that quantum entanglement enhances cognitive performance in implicit learning tasks. Let's ask the question we're all thinking. Is a difference of 614 responses enough to justify such a bold conclusion? The researchers themselves asked this and applied a two-proportion z-test to determine whether the observed difference could be due to chance. This test assesses whether the difference in success rates between two groups is statistically meaningful. The results showed that although the difference in accuracy between the groups was only 3.7%, the probability of this happening by chance was extremely low. When the researchers ran the z-test, the resulting p-value was less than 0.001. This means there's less than a 0.1% chance that the 3.7% difference occurred randomly. Therefore, the 614 response gap between the experimental and control groups is not just statistical noise, but rather strong evidence that quantum entanglement had a meaningful impact on learning. To rule out the possibility that participants were simply guessing at random, the researchers also applied a custom metric they developed called the Q coefficient. Put simply, the Q coefficient measures how much regularity exists in a group's responses. If answers are completely random or based on blind guesses, the Q value comes out low. But if there's a detectable pattern, such as many participants answering the same items correctly or incorrectly, the Q value is higher. In this study, participants using the quantum entangled circuit had a Q value of 3.2%, while the other group scored 3%. The researchers interpret this as follows. Participants connected to the quantum entangled circuit, who showed a higher Q coefficient, may have subconsciously adapted to an invisible pattern and learned it. This is taken as further strong evidence that quantum entanglement may play a role in shaping cognitive learning processes. At the end of the paper, the author concludes that stimuli structured with quantum entanglement led to a noticeable improvement in learning performance, and that this effect left a meaningful imprint on unconscious learning. However, despite all these findings, the author clearly emphasizes that the results alone are not yet sufficient to support broad conclusions. He adds, "Yes, it looks like we've stumbled upon something important, but to fully understand and validate it, the scientific community needs to replicate this study again and again." Although the paper is still very new, the criticisms it has received show that many of the questions we all have are already being raised by other researchers. Chief among these concerns is whether the performance difference observed can be definitively attributed to quantum entanglement. And to be fair, that's not an unreasonable critique. In fact, the author himself acknowledges that the study needs to be replicated multiple times. In summary, he's essentially saying, we've only just cracked the door open. Another point of criticism is that the paper occasionally interprets concepts like intuition and prediction in ways that some find overly speculative, perhaps going beyond the limits of what the experimental data can truly support. As someone who's read the entire paper, I tend to agree with this critique. While I haven't personally seen the raw data, I can say that the statistical methods used appear technically sound. Additionally, one weakness lies in the lack of transparency about how quantum entanglement was actually generated in the circuits. The paper seems to rely heavily on IBM's platform for that assurance, but doesn't clearly explain how entanglement was experimentally verified in this specific setup. Lastly, the fact that the dataset has not yet been made public is another point of criticism. However, given how recent the study is, there's a good chance the data will be released soon. In essence, this experiment needs to be repeated by other independent teams so that a broader statistical pattern can emerge. Without that, it wouldn't be responsible to draw a direct connection between quantum entanglement and consciousness based on this single study alone. See you in the next video.